It's almost Shabbos, and I'd like to share with you another Dvar Torah. The year 2020 will go down as a year of many losses, unfortunately. But there is one silver lining. After the loss of life, the loss of economy, loss of productivity. Actually, there's a study showing that those who worked from home had more productivity than those who ordinarily would commute and go into the office with many distractions. Which leads me to a story of a great rabbi named the Chidah. The Chidah was a rabbi in 1752 in Hebron in Israel. Now the tradition in those times was, in order to support the small community in Israel, they would send out someone who would be impressive to Europe and throughout the world to collect money for the local community so that they'd be able to survive and encourage this relationship. Who would be better to be sent out as this representative better than the Chidah? The Chidah was a genius. He had an encyclopedic memory. He was a great orator and a great writer. And it was in the year 1752 he went out for a 6-year trip throughout Europe. Now there was something which gave him the encouragement to go on this trip, to leave his family, his wife, his children. And you know what that was? He was known as a bibliograph, which means that he studied people, their bibliographies, and their manuscripts. And this would give him a chance to go to the great libraries throughout Europe and continue his research. So after 6 years of visiting Jewish communities throughout the world, he comes back home to Hebron. Now in the year 1772, 20 years after he went out on his first trip, he went out on another trip, again to Europe. And this time, he went to France, he went to Germany, he went to the Netherlands, and he ended up in the Italian city of Livorno. And there was a rule that before any foreigner, especially someone who had done any extensive traveling, entered the city, they had to be quarantined for 40 days. And that's exactly what happened. The Jewish community was very supportive. They found a place for the Chidah, 2 attendants, they brought him food, and they took care of him. And what did the Chidah do during this 40 days that he was in isolation, in his quarantine? The Chidah sat down and wrote his masterwork that he's known till today for, and it's called Shem HaGedolim. With his encyclopedic memory, he had written down the bibliographies of and about manuscripts in this great monumental work. He wrote about over 1,500 great Jewish rabbis which preceded him, and over 2,000 manuscripts and works that had been written before him. And it's called Shem HaGedolim, and he's known for that till this day. He took advantage of his time in isolation. So, for those who wondered where the word quarantine comes from, I know a lot of you speak Spanish, so quarantine and cuarenta is very similar, and it comes from the number 40. Why 40? Because in the year 1400 in Venice, they had a rule that any merchandise that came into the port had to go for 40 days to an island before it was brought into the city. And why 40 days? Where do we get that arbitrary number of 40 days? For that, we don't have to look no further than the holiday we're celebrating this week. We celebrate on Shavuos. God gives the 10 Commandments to the Jewish people, and then Moses goes up the mountain in all the fire and flame and all the clouds. Moses goes up the mountain for how long? 40 days. 40 days and 40 nights, it says. And the Medrash asked, how did Moses know the difference between day and night? Because God studied with him during those 40 days and 40 nights. And during the day, he studied the scriptures. And at night, he studied the Mishnah, which is the oral law. The scriptures are something that's in plain view, open like the day. That's what he studied by the day. And at night, it was the oral law, which is a little more obscure and more debated. So that's how he knew the difference between night and day. Well, we don't have to be like the Chidah or Moshe Rabbeinu to take advantage of our time and appreciate our time. Because specifically now, as we stand between the holiday of Pesach and the holiday of Shavuot, we have the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer. We have to count every single day. Today is one day of the Omer, 2 days of the Omer, until we get to the 50th day, which is the holiday of Shavuot. Why do we have to count it? Let's just look at our calendar. We'll know when the holiday of Shavuot is. The Torah tells us specifically, count the days. Why do we have to count the days? Because this teaches us that the days are important. It's like a commodity. It's like something precious to us. It's not only a commodity, it is the commodity. It's the only commodity that once it's gone, it cannot return. And that's the lesson. We have to take advantage of our time. And when we're talking about counting already, that has to do with this week's Parsha. Because this week, we start the next book, the 4th book of the 5 books of Moses, and it's called Bamidbar. But in English, it's called the Book of Numbers. Why is it called the Book of Numbers? Because this is when the Jewish people begin to be counted. The census is taken of the Jewish people. Why is Moshe responsible for counting the Jewish people? Not one time while they're in the desert, not twice, but 3 times was he instructed to count the Jewish people and report back to God. God doesn't know how many people there are on his planet or how many Jewish people there are, his chosen nation. And the answer, it says in Rashi several times, is since God finds them so precious, he counts them over and over again. So I gave over this message to several people, explaining to them the value of time and how we have to take advantage. And they told me that, Rabbi, it's a great message, but being in quarantine and isolation could become depressing. So that reminds me of another story, which I recently heard, about a great chassid. He's famous. His name was Reb Mendel Futerfas. Many stories I told about Reb Mendel Futerfas. He's most famous for the fact that after World War II, he helped organize the escape of thousands and thousands of Hasidim from Soviet Russia. And since he was one of these organizers, the Soviets were after him, and they eventually caught up with him, and they gave him 10 years of prison in Siberia. And it was 10 years. He sat 10 years. Eventually, he was released from prison, and then he managed to make it on the other side of the Iron Curtain to the free world. But there are many stories about Reb Mendel Futerfas, and this story in particular teaches us how a chassid should act when he's in isolation. Reb Mendel was known as a lebedika, a lively person, a happy person. In any situation he was put in, he always found a light moment, so much so that even the officers in the prison always wanted to be around him because he would make them happy. They were also a little sad being out in the middle of nowhere. And one day, one of the prison guards comes to Reb Mendel and says, I want you to know that one of your friends are here in this prison together with you. He says, who is this? He says, his name is Moshe. He immediately knew who Moshe was. Moshe was his friend, Moshe Vyshetsky. And then the guard tells him, you should know that not only is he here in this prison, he's in a cell directly under your cell downstairs. And if at night you want to communicate with him, bang on the pipes, the heating pipes that go downstairs. You'll get his attention, and through the pipes you'll be able to communicate. And then you'll holler his name, and you'll be able to talk to each other. And so it was. That evening, Reb Mendel bangs on the pipe. He says, Moshe, Moshe. Moshe doesn't understand where these voices are coming from. Then he realizes, I'm Mendel, I'm your friend, I'm upstairs. And the very first thing, after he identifies himself, out of Reb Mendel's mouth is, he says, Reb Moshe, are you happy? Many years later, Moshe Vyshetsky would tell over the story after he was liberated and after he was out of the Soviet Union, and he would say that this saved his life. This line, Reb Moshe, are you happy? You see, he was incarcerated. He was sent off to the Russian Gulag. He was ripped away from his family, his wife, his small children. He didn't know whether he'd ever see them again. And the message that Mendel told him was, one thing's up to you. You could be happy or you could be sad. The Soviets are trying to break you, but if you're strong, you'll overcome this. So in times like this, we all have to ask ourselves, Moshe, are you happy? I wish everyone a good Shabbat.